first of a three-part series on the Indigenous Americas. This slide right here is something that you probably recognize from the prehistoric art lecture. This is again just demonstrating human migration over the course of several thousand years and reminding you that North and South America were very likely the last places to be populated by humans. One of the main ways that people are able to cross this distance is because of these land bridges that are emerging during the Ice Age. So this is some very broad spectrum information on the next three lectures that we're going to cover. So up to 30,000 years ago, again, this slide says 15,000. There's a lot of controversy and wiggle room in terms of the precise dates where people are coming over. There were actually several waves of people that were migrating using this particular method over several thousand years. But in any case, there were lots of agricultural societies that flourished in areas with climate, particularly in the equatorial regions, so around where Central and South America are. There's lots of different kinds of art that we're seeing in the Indigenous Americas. We have architecture. We also have the incorporation of lots of other media and technology, including a really comprehensive understanding of science, particularly astronomy. We also have a lot of artworks that are large and heavy and or uses refined materials such as metals, which is something that we see in a lot of these civilizations that are more sedentary in nature. Some cultures are nomadic hunter-gatherer societies where they are following their food. These tend to be the communities that reside in the plains, the ones that are following bison, for example. In those cases, the artwork tends to be smaller, using non-refined materials, so there's little to no metal, and then they're also portable, which makes sense if you're carrying everything with you as you're following your food. Of course, the more sedentary cultures are going to be making larger artworks, particularly works of architecture, and then using materials like stone, or like heavier items that are going to be more sedentary. There's lots and lots of materials that people in these regions used, and it really depends, like in the on the particular region that you're looking at. There are some communities that use materials that are more or less exclusively available within their areas, whereas others actually establish these really extensive trade networks to obtain materials from far away. We'll see that with the Aztecs in particular. To give you an idea of some of the materials that are being used, we have obsidian, which is a kind of shiny volcanic glass, feathers, animal skins, wood, jade, gold, copper, limestone, amethyst, granite, lots of precious and semi-precious materials, as well as resources that are coming from animals and plants. To give you a sense of what particular areas that we're going to be covering over the next couple of days, I have added some things to this map. Of course, there are many more civilizations than the ones that I have indicated. However, this map is just intended to be like a comprehensive list of the civilizations that they're covering and their approximate locations in North and South America, just so that you can root these things in your mind and figure out where they are. So a lot of these civilizations are coexisting at any given time. And what actually happens in a lot of areas, particularly ones that are very resource rich and hot commodities, there's actually several successive civilizations that are built on top of one another. So this kind of complicates the archaeological record in a lot of cases and also results in a lot of crossover between cultures. Of course, you have to expect that the evidence from older civilizations is oftentimes destroyed or it's degraded so far that we don't really have any understanding of what it is anymore. So the earliest American civilizations are still somewhat of a mystery to science. However, a lot of the early art that has been found is associated with ritual and or burial, which makes sense because when you have burial items, you are burying them, you are isolating and shielding them from the elements, and they're more likely to survive long periods of time. A lot of these items were made for people that were wealthy or of high status, so there tends to be a bias and skewing in terms of the items that survive from those older periods. They tend to be from ritual burials, themselves, as well as items that are buried with very wealthy individuals. Oftentimes, we will see deities and animals as the subjects of art. We will see lots of figures and motifs that combine human and animal imagery as well. There's lots of animals that are associated with power and authority in various Mesoamerican cultures. We will see jaguars featured and pumas featured pretty frequently, as well as snakes. These are animals that are that occupy a specific religious and cultural significance in a lot of the cultures that we cover. We also have architecture that is produced in the more sedentary agricultural societies. Oftentimes, these works of architecture are used for ritual, residential, and public purposes. So there's lots of buildings that are intended to serve as meeting places or ritual spaces or places where people are living. In terms of social classes of artists, in most cases, artists were commoners, but a lot of them could escape menial labor if they were appointed to state projects and workshops. So they could kind of be in a class of their own if they were a person who had a specific skill set and was able to create artwork for people in the ruling class, for example. One of the first cultures that we'll be covering for this unit is the Chavin. So the Chavin occupied coastal Peru and some of the inlands around 1500 years before the Inca civilization cropped up in more or less the same region. The Chavin were extremely influential in Andean South America. So in this region right here, this is where the Andes are, which is this mountain range that flanks the western coast, more or less, of South America. One of the reasons that they were so influential is because Chavín de Huantar, which is the pilgrimage site and kind of like the center of the Chavin people, was visited by pilgrims from lots of regions around the area. And what they would do is that they would purchase wares in Chavín de Huantar and then bring them back to their own localities. So there was this diffusion that was happening over several centuries where you had this artistic style that originated in this capital diffusing to other parts of northwestern-ish South America. So Chavin culture is named after its main archaeological site. We don't know what they called themselves. In the archaeological record, there's not really indications of what they named themselves, but they're named basically by archaeologists after this particular site. There is archaeological evidence that they occupied many areas and climate zones in modern-day Peru, including the coastline as well as these very high-altitude mountainous regions. The capital, Chavín de Huantar, is actually around 10,000 feet above sea level, which is pretty remarkable. A lot of times, due to necessity, the architecture from the civilization is somewhat retrofitted to the topography. That means that it is built to accommodate the location in which it was made. So if there is a cliffside, they'll often take advantage of the cliffs to provide some support to the structure. And we see this in a lot of other Meso and South American cultures as well. There's also lots of buildings that flank rivers or natural waterways, and then they oftentimes have plazas that are facing these optimal views. They're putting buildings in places where there is some sort of aesthetic significance or there is this high or hallowed ground. There's lots of figures in the compositions that are created by the Chavin culture. And then there's also lots of these kind of hybridized human-animal figures. A lot of the work we also see is symmetrical or near symmetrical, so there's a lot of bilateral symmetry that is used. And the primary style that is used to create these sculptures is by polishing a rock or flattening the surface and then carving lines into it. So the style is relatively simple in comparison to some of the styles that we see emerging later, particularly with the Maya culture. That doesn't mean that they're not complex, though, and you'll see in a moment how complex they can get. So this is our artwork for Chavin. It's called Chavín de Huantar, and the primary thing that you should be focusing on for this artwork is the temple. So, as I mentioned previously, the temple is about 10,000 feet above sea level and about 200 feet tall. It's adorned with jaguar sculptures at regular intervals that pop up. Oftentimes jaguars, they're apex predators. They're at the top of the food chain. They are oftentimes regarded as symbols of power and prestige. We'll see in the Maya culture that a lot of rulers have actually named themselves after jaguars. Here's an example of one of those jaguar head motifs right here. This was the religious capital of the Chavin people, and it was a pilgrimage site. As I mentioned previously, there were lots of pilgrims that came from around the area, like 100-mile radius, that came to this site and probably made offerings to the gods and were able to bring back wares from this site to their own homes. What you'll notice when you look at this complex is that it's flanking a river right here. There's also another one that's intersecting right here, and then the sides of the building are oriented along the 4 cardinal directions. This is something that we'll see a lot in Indigenous American architecture. There is almost an obsession with alignment along like cosmological lines or along like north, south, eastern, western axes. There's a lot of speculation in the archaeological community that this was very intentional that they did this. So the Chavín de, one of the reasons that this site was visited so frequently was because it was one of the few breaks in the Andes where people could get from the western coast of the Andes to the east coast and into the areas like Brazil. So this is one of those main corridors that people are able to use to get from one part of the continent to another. So you can imagine that it would be a point where a lot of people are meeting. It's a sort of bottleneck or stopover point. So there were 2 main building phases to Chavín de Huantar's temple. There was the old temple, which is this complex over here. There's lots of these subterranean tunnels that run throughout the old temple. There's still a lot of speculation as to what the particular purpose of those tunnels were. There is some evidence that the tunnels may have been used acoustically to project the voice of a priest or somebody in the temple out into the courtyard or plaza right here, and that would have been like the word of the gods being communicated to the people. There's also a series of tunnels that leads to this massive stone called the Lanzone, which I'll talk about in just a moment. One of the other kind of trends that we'll see in Indigenous American architecture is the plaza. So the plaza is a structure that is usually some sort of gathering area. In most cases, it is a ritual space. In some cases, it is actually a location where people play like ritually significant games or engage in rituals. So this is the Lanzone right here. There's actually a hidden entrance in the old temple complex that leads to a couple of tunnels, and then those tunnels eventually converge on the Lanzone right here. So it's difficult to give you a sense of how large the Lanzone is. It's about 15 feet high, and it's shaped like a blade. So it's relatively flat on both sides, and this is one of those sides right here. And if you were to take the relief sculpture and flatten it out, it would look like this. This is the deity of the Lanzone right here. So it is thought that this is the like patron god of Chavín de Huantar. This statue was not something that was widely available to the public. It was very deep underground. It was in a location that not a lot of people would have been able to access. It's theorized that it was probably just priests that were able to access this location. So a lot of the name is somewhat misleading. Lanzone means large spear or lance in Spanish. However, the stone itself actually more closely resembles a digging stick that is used in Highland architecture, so an item that is used to till the soil. So there's this connection to successful planting and harvest that is implied in the shape of this particular stone. There's also a couple of other motifs when you look at the figure itself that are suggesting a godly status. For one thing, this figure is looking up, so towards the heavens. There's also one hand pointing up, and then there's one hand pointing down. You'll also notice that there are features on this deity right here that are combining both human and animal elements. For one thing, we can see that the figure is bipedal. It's standing on 2 legs. Most animals in this region are quadrupedal. They stand on 4 legs, so this is certainly a human element. We also see these very human-like hands and feet, but the claws are something that you would see like on a jaguar. Same thing with the face right here. These kind of tusks that are sticking out are something that are closer to what you would see on a jaguar. There's also these snake motifs that are used in the upper regions right here and along the belt. Again, snakes are a very common motif in Indigenous American art. We will see them over and over again, and I'll explain why a little bit later. But we see the snakes here being used as hair and eyebrows. So one of the terms that will come up once or twice in this unit is contour rivalry. So contour rivalry is a fancy name for an optical illusion in which 2 images share parts or outlines. So in this image, for example, we have this eyes right here, and then we have a nose, and then a mouth. But if you turn it upside down, then these eyes could also go to this nose and this mouth right here. So this is something that is intended to add complexity and hidden meaning to pieces. Oftentimes this would have been a way for priests to kind of create like a sense of elitism, where it's like, oh, it's not possible for a typical person to understand this image because it's so complex. There's a couple of other pieces that are associated with Chavín de Huantar in the AP curriculum. This is a relief sculpture. So this was found in the ruins of a stairway right here. We see these shallow relief right here. Again, that same sort of style that we're seeing in the Lanzone right here, where it's a stone that's been polished more or less flat with some lines incised in relief right here. So we're seeing some jaguar motifs right here. Some jaguars in profile, and then there's also, again, this kind of contour rivalry where these jaguar heads meeting in profile in the middle could be one kind of central jaguar head, and then we have a couple of snakes over here. Here we are, more snakes. This is a nose ornament. There are several nose ornaments of this type that were found in Chavín de Huantar, and in fact, when you look at Indigenous American art and architecture as a whole, nose ornaments come up pretty frequently. It's one of those sorts of trends that is pretty consistent, at least in Central and South America. So these kinds of nose ornaments were worn by both men and women and were usually symbols of status. They are made of gold, which is a precious material. So you would have had to have been a person of means to afford to commission one of these things. So they were held in place in this top section right here. Either they would be pinched closed or a person would have a piercing. And then we have the snake motif on either side here. Just like we saw in the Lanzone, we have this upward facing gaze as well as this upward facing motion of the snakes and these kind of curling motifs right here. Everything is very circular and intended to represent kind of like the undulating body of the snake. Here's a couple of other pre-Columbian nose rings, because I always get questions from students asking, like, what do the other ones look like? Like, this one just has like a bunch of spiders in it, which is fantastic. Like, look at the degree of detail. Like, amazing. So those of you who are in jewelry this year, some ideas for you. Alrighty, so now we're going to be moving on to the Maya civilization. So the Maya occupied what is now referred to as the Yucatan Peninsula and the surrounding area. So this is modern day, like southeastern Mexico and Guatemala. So Mayan figures have a pretty unique aesthetic. Oftentimes when you look at the profiles of the figures, you have this one continuous line between the top of the forehead and the bottom of the nose. In most like humans, like anatomically, there is a dip that goes right here and then continues on this way. This is just one of those aesthetically pleasing elements one of those aesthetic valuing things that is seen a lot in the Maya culture. There's actually some evidence as well that people in high society actually bound boards to their infants' faces in order to achieve this sort of effect, to shape the skull in a way that was aesthetically pleasing. This is actually present in several Meso and South American cultures. So most Mayan sculpture, and especially the pieces that we're seeing in the curriculum, are tied to monuments and architecture. From the records that we have and what has been discovered thus far, most sculptures are commemorating rulers or people who are associated with rulers. And this makes sense because they would be the people who have the resources to commission these oftentimes very intricate relief sculptures. There's also lots of stepped pyramids in Maya architecture, and we see that trend continue over to the Aztecs. We'll see that in a couple of days when we cover Tenochtitlan. Large pyramids would oftentimes serve as symbols of power and status. We again have this focus on elevation in culture where the taller something is or the bigger something is, the more hierarchically important it is. So it stands to reason that the tallest and largest structures are the most important in any given complex. We see plazas in Maya architecture as well. So here's the plaza here. And there's actually a ball court right here. So ball courts had like recreational and ritual significance in a lot of Central and South American cultures. The game in, I believe, the Maya civilization was called Pactapac, and it involved using your body parts other than your hands and your feet to get a ball through a tiny little hoop. So a lot of the relief sculptures that you see have these crisp outlinings, and they don't have that much three-dimensional modeling. They're relatively flat. There's usually a foreground that is brought forward, and then the background is carved out of the stone and recessed back a little bit, and that creates a little bit of a cast shadow and brings these figures forward. One of the things that you might also notice when you look at these images are these lines of symbols right here. So this is actually a hieroglyphic writing system. So the Maya actually had a writing system that they used to narrate notable accomplishments of their rulers, and then oftentimes to tell like important times in history, cosmological events, and so on. So this glyphic system is still being decoded, and archaeologists have actually been able to figure out what a lot of these lintels say, which is super cool. So our artwork for the Maya civilization is Yaxchilán. This was a royal Mayan city that was hidden for several hundred years. This is something that happens pretty frequently in this region because there's such dense vegetation. There's actually been a lot of this really cool stuff that's been happening recently, where there's been drone footage and AI technologies that is used to figure out areas where Mayan civilizations might have once existed, or settlements. So there's this rediscovery of a lot of these particular complexes that are happening in this dense forest region nowadays. What you'll notice about this particular complex is that it is located in the this portion of a river right here. The Usumacinta River right here kind of loops back on itself right here. This is really a fantastically advantageous strategic location. The river is wide enough that it would be really inconvenient to try to get from one side to the other. There's also a pretty significant elevation. Like this map right here shows elevations. So the meters is like meters above sea level right here. And you notice that they have chosen areas that are relatively high to build a lot of the more important buildings. So this center right here is probably the tallest. And then we also have this complex over here. And then important parts of this complex right here are also relatively tall in comparison to the others. So this particular complex consisted of a main plaza surrounded by several other buildings, and then other kind of complexes that were on the fringes. It was added to over several generations by lots of different rulers that occupied this area. This was a really strategic location as well because of not only the river right here blocking entrance on this side, but also this bottleneck that was happening right here. So you can imagine that it would be really difficult to come in and invade this area because there was this choke-off point that prevented a lot of people from being able to access this area at once. So Yakshilan is known particularly for its numerous carved stelae or stones, and a lot of them are narratives of local history. They depict deities, praise the accomplishments of rulers, and actually give us a lot of insight into the particulars of rituals that people would engage in. All right, so there's a couple of structures that are important to remember for Yakshilan. We have structure 40 and structure 33, which are pretty similar in their physical appearance and method of construction. They're basically one long corbelled vault. So think of taking like a semicircle and then making it into a tunnel. So there are 3 entrances to each of these edifices right here. There's a couple of humans here for scale to give you a sense of how large these buildings are. So they're essentially these relatively small, like, interior spaces, and they're made to look taller because of these structures that are built on top of the buildings called roof combs. So these were almost purely aesthetic in purpose. They're intended to make things look taller. Again, when you invest a lot of time and materials into making something look bigger and it doesn't really serve a purpose, there has to be some sort of significance to the fact that it's so large. So these are roof combs, and in a lot of cases there's additional adornments and relief sculptures that are placed in the areas on the roof comb. So there was a statue right here of a humanoid figure. It's very likely that this was Bird Jaguar, who was the individual that was celebrated and commemorated by the construction of this building. There's lots of relief sculptures and stelae and narrative reliefs that depict the events and accomplishments of each of these rulers. It is thought that they would commission these buildings to basically tell everybody how cool they were and to affirm their seat of power. This is lintel number 25. In structure number 23. So this was originally set above a doorway in a building, and this building was dedicated to Shield Jaguar II and his wife Lady Shock. So Lady Shock right here is shown in the bottom right-hand corner, and she has instruments for giving blood offerings. So she has a bowl right here, and then she has a hand extended out. When you look at her bowl, there's a couple of sheets of bloodletting paper, which is made out of bark, as well as a spine instrument. So there are several different kinds of materials that Maya used in bloodletting rituals. There's this particularly grisly image of a queen pulling a thorny cord through her tongue. It's quite gruesome. So there were lots of, and this was thought to be an offering to the gods and be something that you would do to perpetuate the cycle of life and to maintain order in the cosmos. The letting of blood was not something that was violence for violence sake, as a lot of people tend to assume, but rather it was something that was seen as necessary to maintain order, and it was one of the duties of members of the royal family in order to make sure that things proceeded as they were supposed to. So Lady Shock right here is shown in a beautifully detailed garment right here. And she also has this elaborate headdress on. She's obviously a lady of high society here. And she is looking up at this visioned serpent that she has summoned. So one of the things that people would do in these bloodletting rituals is that sometimes they would lose so much blood that they would start to hallucinate. And oftentimes those hallucinations were seen as visions, or they were recorded down and used to basically communicate the will of the gods to the people. So in this particular case, the hallucination here is this vision serpent, which emerges from over here, more or less, and then there's this large serpent head right here, and then there's another figure that is coming out of the serpent's head. The identity of this figure is not quite known. It's thought that it could be like a mirror image of Lady Shock, it could be an ancestral deity, or some sort of god. We're not entirely sure. So there's a hieroglyphic inscription that is going around the piece right here. Interestingly, this is inverted, so it's actually flipped backwards as if it were a mirror. The intention of this is not entirely clear, but it might be like a reflection of the other side of existence, or like looking into a reflection. The date of Shield Jaguar II, her husband's ascension to the throne, is also noted in this inscription, so it is implied that this was some sort of ritual that was done upon her husband's ascent to the throne to basically secure his rule and to honor it. When you look at this piece, you're again noticing a lot of similarities to the Chavin culture in terms of these very complex designs, lots of snake motifs, but in this case, we're seeing a written language, a hieroglyphic language, which is not something that we saw with the Chavin culture. We are now going to move northward to the Anasazi culture. So in the Navajo language, the word Anasazi means ancient ones. Nowadays, this culture is referred to as the ancestral Puebloans. So the Anasazi, or ancestral Puebloans, occupied the American Southwest. So that would be modern-day New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, and Utah. So the Anasazi are best known for their dwellings, which the Spanish settlers who came into the area later called pueblos. So pueblos consisted of these many small rooms that could be reached through windows, doors, and ladders. Here is a cross-section of a pueblo right here. So there were oftentimes these cubicular rooms that were separated by small windows. Of course, there were oftentimes air vents to permit airflow. They kind of look like ant colonies to me in terms of like these sectioned areas that are intended for different things. So the wall thickness of a pueblo determined how high a structure could be. You can imagine that if your walls and the foundations are really thin, you wouldn't be able to build too high because it's not going to be able to support anything. So the tallest were about 4 stories tall. So the foundations of these buildings were oftentimes made of stone, and then they would use wood as a foundation, and then they would cover the wood in stucco and some sort of like stone or brick. In most cases, pueblos faced a central plaza, which served as a social and religious center of the complex. So when we look at the Mesa Verde cliff dwellings, these are the pueblos right here, and then these are kivas, which are these fire pits, and then this was the plaza right here. So these are the Mesa Verde cliff dwellings. These are in the Four Corners region, so that region that is right where New Mexico, Colorado, and Arizona and Utah kind of intersect. It creates this kind of intersection. I've actually been here. It was a long time ago when I was like 10. I wasn't very excited. It was pretty boring to me at the time. I'd love to go back. But in any case, the pueblo structures were built right into the cliffside below a mesa. So mesa is Spanish for table. In this case, mesas are oftentimes used to refer to plateaus or like relatively flat areas that have an overhang and then some sort of area underneath. You can imagine that if you were a person coming across this area 1,500 years ago, that you would have been like, yeah, this is a great area. It's shaded from the really intensely hot sun. It's also relatively hidden, and we could make something cool out of this. So this was a really strategically advantageous location for people to live, which is probably why they built this small community here. So this community probably housed around 250 people. It probably would have been a couple of clans that had banded together for mutual support and defense. They were all kind of looking out for each other. The Anasazi in this case were actually agricultural, and they would conduct a lot of farming in the area above the mesa, and then they would bring water and food and all of their materials down into this area right here. So it was worth the effort of having to move stuff back and forth enough for this location here. So the top ledges of the pueblos were usually really cool and dry, so that made these areas really ideal for storing supplies, especially when you have things like the weather, anything between like a really hot, like baking sun and snow. So having this this overhang right here will protect not only your bodies, but whatever resources that you manage to collect during those like agriculturally fertile periods. So these structures all face a main plaza, which is right here. And then there's also these circular pits throughout, and these are called kivas. So these were usually used for gathering or ritual purposes. There's actually, when you go to Mesa Verde, you can actually see the kivas. They're quite large, and they're made using this sort of corbelled masonry. They're circular, and they oftentimes have these sort of pillars that are engaged in the sides right here, and there would have been some sort of wood that was used as a roof to cover these areas. What's really interesting is that there were several adaptations in place to make sure that the people inside didn't die of carbon monoxide poisoning. So there was this vent right here, which was carved into the side, and that would be one sort of ventilation shaft that was used to make sure that all of the nasty air and smoke didn't build up in this structure. There was also a hole that was built into the roof to make sure that the smoke would go up. There was also this particular structure right here called a deflector, which was put in between the vent and the fire pit to prevent the air from coming in and blowing the fire out here. So it's just kind of like a block. So these were specifically engineered to keep this area inside here nice and warm and well ventilated. Sipapu is not a term that's going to come up on the AP exam, I don't think. Typically, this is something that was used as part of ritual, from what I understand. We are now going to move a little bit to the northeast to the Mississippian culture. So the Mississippians were that's a very broad term to describe dozens upon dozens of cultures that existed in what is now the Midwest. So this is a map right here that kind of explains the extent of these cultures and how many different cultures that there were. And these are just the ones that we know of. So you'll notice that a lot of them are in these areas that are flanked by waterways. Again, having a near source of water is something that is really advantageous to a lot of these civilizations because you're able to have agriculture and irrigation. So that's one of the reasons why they're called the Mississippian cultures, because they're by the Mississippi River. So most of these settlements were agricultural, and one of the main kind of hallmarks of these cultures and why they were so successful is that they came up with this ingenious farming technique that involved these plants that are referred to as the three sisters. So we have squash, corn, and beans. So they were all grown together to facilitate this symbiotic and efficient farming. Here's how it worked. So the squash would provide enough ground cover to prevent weeds from sprouting up, so that would prevent invasive species from coming in and taking up all the nutrition in the soil. The corn would provide a structural place for beans to grow, so they would be able to wind up the stalk of the corn here. And then beans and other legumes have mycorrhizae, which is a special kind of fungus that grows in their roots, and they are really good and efficient at recruiting nitrogen in the soil. So oftentimes beans are planted in areas to facilitate the movement of nitrogen in the soil to the surrounding plants because those mycorrhizae are able to do that. I mean, that's something that's more in biology, but the idea here is that growing these three items together is intended to facilitate the growth and survival of all of them, which is just really, really ingenious. So some of these settlements became population centers with social hierarchy. So you had a ruling individual and then several people under them. A lot of them had advanced technologies, including the ability to work with metal. A lot of them had a very profound understanding of cosmology and the movement of the stars and planets. There were actually several ancient city-states that governed these large swath of lands and were known for their ability to build these massive mound complexes. One of the most famous of these city-states was Cahokia. And this is one mound in those regions. To give you a sense of scale as to how large these are, this is a car, which is pretty fantastic. Again, this is an age before tractors and before there were tools out there that were used to efficiently move large areas of earth. So this was all moved by hand. So you can imagine that there's some sort of significance to these mounds in this idea that people are spending this much time and this much effort in building them. So you can imagine that mounds would serve as a strategic location. It gives you a pretty high vantage point for seeing the stuff around you. There's also, again, this kind of like position of hierarchy where the higher you are, the more important you are. So mounds were sometimes built to support structures like we see in this reenactment here, but the purpose of these less utilitarian mounds is not as well understood, especially given how a lot of these civilizations have been layered on top of one another. So the provenance of some mounds is not really well understood, and it's actually believed that several of these mounds were started by one culture and then added to and completed by others. So that kind of confounds the archaeological record in a lot of ways. So this is the Great Serpent Mound right here. This is one of those mystery mounds where we're not entirely sure what its purpose is, but we still have a couple of guesses based on the context. So to give you a sense of how large this is, it is around 1,300 feet long and around 1 to 3 feet tall. Here is a section of the Great Serpent Mound right here, and then a couple of people taking pictures to give you a sense of the scale. So mounds like these were usually added to and changed over several years and mound building campaigns. So there would be like specific times when people are like, yes, let's go add to the mound. It's not like it was built from start to finish in one kind of continuous timeline in most cases. There don't seem to be any temples or burials that are associated with this mound. So there's not really enough evidence to substantiate that this was built to commemorate like a particular like temple or a deity or a burial of some sort. Of course, there could have been stuff buried there that was removed. Again, this kind of goes back to the hypothesis of maybe some people came upon this mound and they took this stuff out and then they added their own stuff. Again, the provenance is not entirely clear. But it was very likely built by the Fort Ancient culture who were influenced by the Mississippiians, who were those mound builders. So what's interesting about this piece is that it can only really be fully appreciated from a high vantage point. And of course, the technology to do this was not present at the time of construction, which was around 1,000 years ago. So that's kind of adding to the mystery of it. I highly recommend, if you want to see other kind of like mystery images that you can't even really perceive unless you go up into the sky, look at the Nazca lines, N-A-Z-C-A, Nazca lines. They're in Peru and they're fantastic. So there's a couple of theories as to what this means or represents. A lot of people theorize that it is a snake. So again, we're going back to that serpent motif. Snakes are associated with crop fertility in a lot of Meso and South American cultures. You can imagine that, like, in the West, snakes are seen as like particularly vile. There's association with Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden and like being the root of all evil. But in Meso and South American cultures, snakes serve a really agriculturally important role in that they eat a lot of the mice and the rats that actually would like eat the corn and the squash and the beans and all of those other important crop items. So in this sense, snakes are seen as beings that are worthy of reverence and worthy of respect and are oftentimes deified. They're made into gods. So it stands to reason that this very well could be a snake. The snake image right here, this could be the tail and then this is the head. A lot of people theorize that this is the mouth and it's swallowing the sun. So this could be referencing like an eclipse where the sun is disappearing in the middle of the day. It might depict an astrological phenomenon like a comet. So Halley's Comet would have been visible around 1066 CE. So maybe people saw it in the sky and they're like, we got to make a picture of that. It could also be a calendar. There's some evidence that suggests that that this was used as a calendar, something to determine when to plant stuff, when to harvest stuff. The head of the comet is pointed in the direction of the summer solstice sunset. And then there's also some connections to the phases of the moon in the curves here. There's lots of different theories. There hasn't really been one set thing that everybody has agreed on quite yet.